Claire Evans never imagined her life would start to feel like someone else's story, one she didn't remember choosing. At 51, living in a quiet suburb of Portland. Her days were predictable. Morning coffee alone, work calls, an empty house by evening. Her husband Mark was successful but distant, always busy, always tired. His affection reduced to brief nods and distracted smiles. They'd been married for 26 years, but somewhere along the way, the closeness had quietly disappeared. What once felt like love had turned into polite companionship. They didn't fight, but they didn't connect either. Claire couldn't remember the last time they'd laughed together, the kind of laugh that makes you forget the years in between. She'd tried everything: weekend trips, dinners out, soft conversations. But Mark had a way of shutting down emotions with a few cold words. "I'm just stressed, Claire. Stop overthinking." One evening, as she sat alone on their porch, watching the rain streak the windows, she realized she couldn't do it anymore. Not the silence, not the loneliness. Her friend Megan, a retired teacher, had noticed the sadness in her eyes and suggested therapy. "Sometimes," Megan said, "you just need someone who listens." That's how Claire found herself sitting in a small, warmly lit office 2 weeks later. The plaque on the door read Dr. James Porter, licensed therapist. From the moment she stepped in, something about the room felt safe. There was a quiet hum from a diffuser, the smell of cedar and peppermint in the air, and books neatly stacked on the shelves behind the desk. Then she met James' mid-40s, kind eyes, calm voice. His presence was steady, the kind that instantly made people breathe easier. "Take your time," said softly as she settled onto the couch. "We'll start wherever you feel comfortable." It took only minutes for Claire to begin talking about her marriage, her exhaustion, the sense of fading from her own life. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding back until the words started tumbling out. James listened without interrupting. He didn't rush her. He didn't judge. When she paused, he said quietly, "You've been taking care of everyone but yourself, haven't you?" Her throat tightened. No one had ever noticed that before, not even Mark, for the first time in years. Claire felt truly seen. Over the next few weeks, their sessions became something she looked forward to. She would drive across town, watching the city lights blur through her windshield, feeling both nervous and excited. Therapy had started as a place to release her pain, but slowly it became a space where she could feel again. James had a way of asking questions that went deeper than expected. "When did you stop believing you deserved joy?" he asked one day. Claire looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "Maybe when Mark stopped looking at me the same way." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You tied your happiness to someone who forgot to hold it." His words lingered long after the session ended. She repeated them in her head while folding laundry, while driving home, while lying awake in bed beside Mark's sleeping figure. The simplicity of his voice, the truth in it, it stirred something deep inside her. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Claire entered the office looking defeated. Work had been stressful, and Mark had canceled dinner plans again, saying he was too exhausted. She tried to talk about it during her session, but halfway through, her voice cracked. Tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Embarrassed, James leaned forward, his tone gentle. "Don't apologize for feeling." He passed her a tissue and waited quietly. Something about the silence felt comforting, the kind that holds space, not judgment. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and she saw a kind of empathy that almost broke her. He said softly, "You've carried too much for too long. It's okay to let someone help." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit deep. For years, she had been the helper, the fixer, the calm one. No one had ever offered her comfort like that, not sincerely. The session ended with a small, reassuring smile from him. But as she stood to leave, James reached out briefly and rested his hand on her shoulder. It was a professional gesture, steady, reassuring, yet something about it made her heart race. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was the shock of being noticed with care. That night, she thought about that moment longer than she should have. She felt foolish for it, but it was the first time in years that anything had made her feel alive. Over the next few sessions, Claire found herself opening up more easily. She talked about her youth, her dreams, her love of painting, things she hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. James listened intently, sometimes smiling when she spoke about her old passions. "You should paint again," he said once. "There's still color in you, Claire. You just stopped seeing it." The words caught her off guard. No one had ever spoken to her like that, gently. But with conviction, she started painting again the following weekend, setting up her old easel by the window. The brush in her hand felt like rediscovering a piece of herself she'd forgotten. She wanted to tell James to show him that she was changing, and she did, the next time she saw him. His reaction was genuine. "I'm proud of you," he said, smiling. "That's a big step." The warmth in his voice stayed with her all day. But slowly Claire began to feel a shift, something quiet but undeniable. She found herself thinking about James outside of their sessions, wondering what his life was like beyond those walls. She noticed the small things, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the way he adjusted his glasses when she said something that moved him. It was harmless, she told herself. Just admiration for someone kind. Yet each session felt heavier, filled with things unspoken. One afternoon, near the end of a long session, Claire laughed softly after sharing a story about her teenage son. James smiled, but then his expression softened. "You have such warmth when you talk about your family," he said quietly. "You should receive that same warmth back." The comment lingered between them, fragile and loaded. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Then she gathered her things and said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for listening." He nodded. Always. When she left that day, the air outside felt different, colder, sharper. Claire couldn't explain it, but she sensed a boundary had been crossed. Not in words, not in actions, but in feeling. That night, she avoided looking at Mark as they ate dinner. When he asked how therapy was going, she said it was fine. But her heart was beating faster than usual. The truth scared her. She knew she was getting too close emotionally. Not physically, but part of her didn't want to stop. It was the first time in years that someone had made her feel valued, understood, and alive. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering the quiet tone of James's voice, the way he said you deserve warmth. And in the stillness of that night, she wondered whether she had crossed a line, or if she had simply found a version of herself she thought was gone. The next morning, she looked at herself in the mirror. There was a faint glow in her reflection, something between guilt and rediscovery. She didn't know where this path was leading, but she knew one thing for sure. Something inside her had changed forever. The following week, Claire sat in her car outside James's office longer than usual. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, but her mind was somewhere else. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but she could feel something had shifted inside her. Something quiet yet undeniable. She told herself it was only admiration, gratitude, even. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. When she finally walked in, James greeted her with his usual calm smile. "Claire," he said warmly, "it's good to see you." It was a simple greeting, but the way he said it with genuine softness made her feel seen in a way her husband hadn't in years. As she sat down, the session began, like always. She talked about her week, how she'd tried cooking a new recipe that Mark barely touched, how their conversations had grown thinner, quieter. James listened, leaning slightly forward, his tone thoughtful. "You're craving connection," he said, "but you're trying to find it in a place that's already empty." The truth of his words made her chest ache. "I just wish he'd notice me again," she whispered. James paused, his eyes steady on hers. "Sometimes people stop seeing us not because we've changed, but because they stopped looking. That's not your fault." Claire looked down, her throat tight. "It still hurts." "I know," he said softly, "but you're learning to see yourself again, and that's powerful." His words washed over her like comfort and guilt all at once. She nodded, brushing away a tear that escaped before she could stop it. When she looked up, he handed her a tissue. their hands brushing for the briefest second. The touch was small, fleeting, but it made her heart skip. She quickly pulled her hand back, embarrassed. James pretended not to notice, but something unreadable passed through his eyes. The rest of the session passed quietly. When it ended, James said in his calm voice, "You've come a long way, Claire. Don't underestimate that." She smiled weakly and left, but the moment lingered long after she got home. She replayed the look in his eyes, the tone in his voice. She told herself it was just therapy. That warmth was part of the job. But her heart refused to listen. Days passed. Her marriage felt emptier than ever. Mark was working late almost every night, and even when he was home, he was distant, absorbed in his phone or the news. One evening, she tried to talk about a movie she'd watched, but he mumbled, "Not now, Claire. I'm tired." Something inside her sank. She realized she didn't expect warmth from him anymore. She'd stopped hoping for it. The next time she saw James, tried to act casual. But as soon as their eyes met, she felt the same rush of emotion. He noticed something different about her, too. "You seem heavy today," he said gently. She gave a weak smile. "It's been hard. I feel invisible at home. Tell me about it." So she did. She talked about years of silence, of trying and being met with indifference. James listened quietly, then said, "You deserve someone who listens, Claire. Not just here, everywhere." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," he admitted. "But it's possible." The air between them grew still. There was an understanding, quiet, dangerous, unspoken dot. The next few sessions continued like that, filled with words that healed and glances that said, but neither dared to speak. James was professional, but the tone of their conversations had softened, become more personal. He'd ask how she slept, whether she was painting again, whether she'd eaten breakfast that day. Small things, but they meant everything to her. Claire began dressing differently before her appointments. She'd fix her hair carefully, put on soft perfume, and tell herself it was for confidence. But she knew she wanted to look her best for him. One afternoon, the session took an unexpected turn. Claire was talking about how she'd found one of Mark's old love letters from when they were dating. Reading it made her cry. Realizing how much had changed, she whispered, "I don't even recognize us anymore." James leaned forward, his tone low. "Do you recognize yourself?" She shook her head. "Not lately." He stood, walked to the shelf, and handed her a notebook. "Start writing again. Not for anyone else, for you. Put down everything you've lost and everything you still want." Claire smiled faintly, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You always know what to say." "Maybe because I listen," he replied softly. For a moment, silence filled the room. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy with something unnamed. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of emotion neither could disguise. She stood to leave, clutching the notebook to her chest. "Thank you, James." He hesitated before responding. "Take care of yourself, Claire." His voice was quiet but carried something warmer than usual, almost personal. That night, Claire wrote in the notebook for hours. She wrote about the woman she used to be, about laughter in small kitchens, about the love she once believed would last forever. But she also wrote about James, about his calm eyes, his patience, his kindness. She wrote things she knew she'd never say aloud. Over the next few weeks, her emotions grew tangled. She started checking the clock eagerly on therapy days, counting hours until she'd see him again. It scared her, but she couldn't help it. He had become her comfort, her escape, her quiet happiness. During one session, she tried to pull back emotionally. She spoke less, avoided eye contact. But James noticed. "You're holding back," he said softly. I think I've depended too much on this," she admitted. "On you." He was silent for a long time. "It's okay to find comfort here," he said eventually. "But remember, healing also means learning to trust yourself again." Claire smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened. "You make it sound easy." He smiled back, a sad, understanding smile. "It never is." There was warmth in his expression that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't the look of a therapist anymore. It was human, emotional, fragile. When the session ended, she stood by the door, hesitating. She wanted to say something, anything, but words failed her. James looked at her, waiting, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without these talks," he replied gently. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. You'd find your way." But when she walked out, she knew it wasn't true. She was already too attached to the words, the silence, the safety of that room, as weeks passed. Her feelings grew harder to hide. Every conversation felt charged with something deeper. She knew it was dangerous, wrong even. But her heart refused to listen. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon. Claire arrived earlier than usual, her heart restless. The air outside was heavy with summer heat, and inside, the office felt unusually still. She sat down, and before she could speak, James said softly, "You seem distant today." She sighed. "Maybe I am. I've been thinking a lot about what?" She hesitated. "About where all this is going?" He leaned back, his face thoughtful. "You mean therapy?" She nodded slowly. "And beyond that?" There was silence, long and loaded. Neither moved. Then, very gently, James said, "Sometimes when we're vulnerable, we confuse understanding with affection. It's natural." Claire looked down, her voice trembling. "What if it's more than that?" The question hung in the air, unspoken and irreversible. James didn't answer right away. His expression softened, but his eyes revealed something she hadn't seen before: conflict. "Claire," he said quietly, "feelings are complicated, but healing means facing them honestly." The session ended quietly. No goodbyes, just a lingering glance that said too much. As Claire walked to her car, the world felt both brighter and heavier. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she couldn't pretend anymore. Something inside her heart had already crossed a line, even if her actions hadn't. The weekend after that tense session, Claire couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said and what she hadn't. Her words kept echoing in her head. What if it's more than that? She had never planned to say it. It just slipped out, pulled from a part of her heart she hadn't controlled in years. For 2 days, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face, serious, but also filled with something he didn't say. She thought about how carefully he'd listened to her for months, how he'd helped her find herself again. But she also thought about Mark, her husband, who had once been her best friend. The guilt twisted inside her like a knot dot by Monday morning. She had decided she needed to end therapy, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The emotions had gone too far. She couldn't sit in that room anymore pretending it was just therapy when it clearly WASN single quotes T dot when she walked into the office that afternoon. She already felt tears pressing behind her eyes. James looked up from his desk, surprised. "Claire," he said softly, "you look upset. Is everything all right?" She sat down, clutching her hands together. "I think I need to stop coming," she said quickly, before her courage faded. James blinked. "Why?" She hesitated, then said in a trembling voice, "Because I crossed a line. I started feeling things I shouldn't. You've been kind, patient, and good to me. And I let it turn into something else." For a long moment, James didn't speak. His eyes lowered to the floor. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet. "Claire, you're not the first person to feel that. When people are deeply understood, it can stir emotions that feel confusing. But I want you to know, you didn't do anything wrong by being human." His words were gentle, but they only made the ache worse. "It feels wrong," she said softly, "because I started to depend on this. On you." James nodded slowly. "Therapy can open doors we didn't expect. What matters is that you see it clearly, and you are." There was silence for a long moment. The hum of the clock filled the space between them. Claire felt a single tear slip down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't need to be," he replied. "You came here to find yourself, and maybe that's what this feeling is. A reminder that you're still capable of emotion. You're alive again." She looked up, eyes glistening. Alive, but lost. He gave a faint smile. That's how most beginnings feel. She wanted to say something. Anything, but her throat was tight. Finally, she stood up, trying to steady her voice. "Thank you for everything. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." He rose too, his hands in his pockets. "You did the work, Claire. Don't forget that." She reached out her hand. It was a simple gesture of goodbye, but when he took it, there was a pause, brief but heavy. Their eyes met, and in that silence, there was every emotion they couldn't express: gratitude, longing, and restraint. Then he gently let go. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. Claire nodded, her voice barely audible. "You too." She left the office with her heart pounding. The moment she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face like a rush of clarity. She didn't look back. She knew if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to walk away. That night, she sat on her porch, the same one where months ago she'd first realized her marriage was falling apart. The rain was light, the sky soft and gray. She thought about James, about how he had helped her rediscover parts of herself she thought were gone forever. But she also thought about what she'd almost lost: her integrity, her balance, her sense of right and wrong. In the quiet of that evening, she made a decision. She was going to try to rebuild her marriage. Not for obligation, but because she wanted peace. The next morning, she found Mark sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, surprised to see her dressed early. "Everything okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "No, not really. But I want it to be." He put the phone down. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, "I've been lonely, Mark, for a long time. And I think you have too. We stopped seeing each other. We just became polite strangers." Mark looked uncomfortable, like a man suddenly seeing the truth of his own reflection. "I didn't realize it was that bad," he admitted quietly. "It was," she said honestly. "But I'm not blaming you. I just don't want to live like that anymore. If we can fix this, if there's still something left, I want to try." For the first time in years, Mark's eyes softened. He nodded slowly. "Maybe we both stopped trying," he said. The conversation was awkward but real. They didn't solve everything that morning, but it was the first honest talk they'd had in years. In the following weeks, Claire started making small changes. She began cooking again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to share moments. She suggested walks after dinner. Sometimes Mark said yes, sometimes no, but she didn't stop asking. At the same time, she missed therapy terribly. There were moments she almost picked up her phone to email James to thank him again, to ask how he was. But she never did. She knew reaching out would reopen feelings she was trying to let fade instead. She channeled that energy into herself, painting, writing, journaling like James had taught her. Her notebook filled with reflections about love, choices, regret, and rediscovery. She realized that what she had felt for James wasn't really about him. It was about what he represented: understanding, tension, warmth. Weeks turned into months. Her marriage didn't magically heal, but it softened. Mark started helping in small ways, setting the table, asking about her day. One evening, he brought home her favorite tea without being asked. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a spark. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled a little. "You've been different lately. Happier?" "Maybe I finally started remembering who I am," she said, later that night, as they sat on the porch together watching the sunset. Claire felt a strange peace settle inside her. She realized she didn't need anyone else to complete her. Not Mark, not James. She just needed to keep choosing herself every day. Months later, Claire passed by the same street where James's office was located. Out of habit, she slowed down. Through the window, she saw the familiar glow of the lamp and a new patient sitting in the waiting room. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia, but also gratitude. That place had been where she'd broken down, but also where she'd begun to rebuild. She smiled softly, whispered a quiet thank you to the memory, and drove on. When she got home, Mark was in the garden fixing the small fence. He looked up and waved, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: quiet contentment. Not the dizzying excitement of new affection, but something steadier, calmer, real. That night, as she wrote in her journal, she wrote a single line that summed up everything she'd learned. Sometimes the people who wake us up aren't meant to stay. They're just meant to remind us that we're still alive. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and felt at peace. The ache was gone. In its place was something better: acceptance. For the first time in years, she slept deeply, her heart light, her mind quiet, and in the morning, as the sun rose over the quiet street, Claire Evans smiled. Not because her life was perfect, but because she was finally living it again. Emma Clark's life had become predictable, the kind of quiet routine that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. She was 34, married for 8 years to Daniel, a respected architect in Portland. They had a charming house with a white fence, 2 cars, and polite smiles for neighbors. Yet behind closed doors, there was distance, the kind that grew so slowly. Neither of them noticed when it began. Every morning, Daniel left before sunrise, his coffee still warm on the counter. Every night, he returned, tired, his mind full of deadlines. Emma would ask about his day. He'd nod and mumble something about work. Then they'd eat in silence, watching television more out of habit than interest. They weren't unhappy exactly, just disconnected. Like 2 people standing side by side, staring at different horizons. One Friday evening, Emma's best friend Lauren called her. "You need to get out," Lauren insisted. "There's a charity art exhibit downtown tonight. Music, people, wine. You'll love it." "I don't know," Emma said, glancing at her half-finished dinner. "I don't feel like dressing up." "That's exactly why you should come. You've been living like a ghost." Lauren always had a way of getting through to her. So Emma sighed, changed into a simple navy dress, and drove downtown. That the art gallery was filled with soft jazz and polite laughter. Candles flickered along white walls painted with color and emotion. Emma wandered alone, wineglass in hand, pretending to study the paintings. She felt out of place until she heard a quiet voice behind her. "You look like someone trying to understand more than the art." She turned and saw a man standing beside her. He was in his late 30s, dressed simply but neatly, with thoughtful eyes that seemed to look right through her. His name was Ethan. "I guess I am," she said. Smiling nervously, he nodded toward the painting in front of them. A stormy ocean under a golden sky. "The artist said it's about conflict and hope. I think it's about holding on when everything's falling apart." His words caught her off guard. "That's a beautiful way to put it." They talked for nearly an hour, moving from art to books to the little things in life that most people overlooked. For the first time in months, Emma felt seen. Not as a wife or someone's plus one, just as herself, when she finally said she should go. Ethan handed her a small business card. "If you ever want to see how I capture stories, come by my studio." She hesitated, then took it. "Maybe I will." That night, back home, Daniel was already asleep. Emma placed Ethan's card on her nightstand, told herself it was nothing, and turned off the light. But she couldn't sleep. The next morning, Daniel left for another business trip. As his car disappeared down the street, Emma stared at her coffee, thinking about the studio. Her mind argued against it, but curiosity whispered louder. By noon, she was driving across town, her heart beating faster with every mile. Ethan's studio was tucked inside a renovated warehouse filled with natural light. The walls were covered with photographs, faces of strangers, moments frozen in time. Emma stood in awe. Each picture seemed to hold a story. Raw and real. Ethan appeared from behind a curtain, smiling. "You came," he said softly. "I was nearby," she lied, though they both knew she wasn't. He showed her around portraits of elderly couples, street performers, children running through rain. "Every photo," he said, "is a memory someone let me keep." Something about his words stirred her heart. They sat down, talked again about creativity, dreams, fears. Time slipped by unnoticed. When she finally left, evening light poured through the windows, and for the first time in years, she felt alive that night when Daniel called to check in. She smiled faintly at his voice. "How's the trip?" she asked, Busy? He said. You know how it is. Yes, she replied quietly, staring at her reflection in the window. I know. The next few days were filled with thoughts she didn't want to admit. She told herself it wasn't wrong to have a friend, yet part of her knew the line was dangerously close. She promised herself she wouldn't see Ethan again. But promises made to ourselves are often the easiest to break. A week later, Lauren invited her to a dinner party. You'll love the people, she said. Normal, funny, no pressure. Emma agreed, hoping for distraction. The house buzzed with laughter, candles, and soft music. Then she met Ryan. He was the opposite of Ethan, loud, confident, and magnetic. A financial consultant, charming in the effortless way that made everyone lean closer when he spoke. He noticed Emma immediately. You don't seem like you belong here, he said with a grin. Why's that? She asked, amused. Because you're the only one not pretending to be impressed. She laughed, and it felt good, carefree and easy. Ryan had a way of pulling her into his world, full of jokes and energy. They talked, danced, and for a moment, she forgot about everything else. Driving home, she couldn't stop thinking about the two men. Ethan made her feel understood. Ryan made her feel desired. And somewhere between those two feelings was a truth she didn't want to face. She was lonely that night. Daniel texted her a photo from his hotel, a conference room, neat and cold. Long day. Miss you. She stared at the message for a long time before replying. Miss you too, but she didn't feel it. Over the next few weeks, her life began to split in two. Mornings were quiet, laundry, emails, silence. Afternoons brought messages from Ethan, who sent photos of sunrises and city streets. Evenings sometimes brought calls from Ryan, full of teasing and energy. Each man showed her something she'd lost in herself. Ethan reminded her of depth and purpose. Ryan reminded her of youth and laughter. She didn't intend for any of it to happen, it just did. One day, while Daniel was away again, Ethan invited her to join him at a local art fair. She almost said no, but agreed. They walked among the stalls, talking about color and light, but beneath the surface. Emotion lingered. At one point, Ethan stopped and looked at her seriously. Emma, I don't want to make your life complicated, but I also don't want to pretend there's nothing here. She felt her breath catch. Ethan. He shook his head. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Later that night, Ryan called, his voice light and teasing as always. You've been quiet lately. Did someone steal your smile? Emma smiled faintly. Maybe I misplaced it. Well, Ryan said, I plan on finding it. When she hung up, her chest ached. How had her life become this? Two men offering her what her marriage had lost? She still loved Daniel, or at least the idea of him. But they had become strangers who shared a house. One evening, she found Daniel's wedding photo tucked between old albums. They looked happy, hopeful. She touched the picture and whispered, Where did we go? She didn't have an answer. The next day, Daniel returned home early from his trip. He seemed tired, distracted, but when he hugged her, it felt different, heavier. We need to talk, he said softly. Emma froze. For a second, she feared he knew everything. But instead, he said, I think we've been drifting apart, and I don't want to lose you. Tears filled her eyes. She nodded, but guilt gnawed at her heart. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, torn between past and present. Comfort and passion, truth and deception. The next morning, she decided she needed to make a choice, not between Ethan or Ryan, but between who she was and who she was becoming. She didn't know yet that the truth about both men would soon shatter everything she believed about loyalty, love, and herself. Because sometimes the real shock isn't what others hide from us, it's what we discover about our own hearts when we finally stop pretending. The following week felt heavy for Emma. Every morning she tried to fill her time with errands, chores, and meaningless routines, but her mind refused to stay quiet. Ethan's calm eyes, Ryan's laughter, and Daniel's tired face all played in her head like fragments of different lives. She was somehow living at once, She had always thought of herself as a loyal person, steady, grounded. But now she couldn't recognize the woman she was becoming. It wasn't that she wanted to betray anyone. It was that she was trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. One rainy afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Would you come by the studio? I need a second opinion on a project." She stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Okay." The rain fell in soft sheets as she drove to his studio. Inside, it smelled of coffee and old wood. He was editing photos on his computer, portraits of different people, each one raw with emotion. "You capture people so honestly," she said, looking at the screen. "I try to," he replied, glancing at her. "I think honesty is rare these days." His tone was calm but meaningful. She felt the weight behind his words. There was silence between them, not uncomfortable, but full of everything neither dared to say. Ethan finally sighed. "Emma, I told myself I'd stay away, but I can't ignore what I feel. I don't want to complicate your life, but I can't pretend either." Her heart pounded. She didn't move closer, but she didn't step back. "Ethan, this isn't simple," she whispered. "I'm married." "I know," he said softly. "That's why I've done nothing but feel." For a long moment, they stood still, the space between them charged with emotion, yet untouched by action. Then Emma took a slow breath. "I think I should go." He nodded. "I understand." As she stepped outside, the cool rain felt almost cleansing. She sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine. She didn't know if she was running from temptation or from herself. The next few days passed quietly. Daniel seemed more attentive since their talk, trying to reconnect. He asked about her day, cooked dinner once, even suggested a weekend away. It was the first time in years he'd mentioned time alone. "Maybe we can drive up to Cannon Beach," he said. "Like we used to." She smiled faintly. "That sounds nice." Still inside, she couldn't stop thinking about the two men, Ethan's depth and Ryan's charm. She hadn't heard from Ryan in a while, which made her oddly restless. Then, out of nowhere, he called. "Hey, stranger," he said, his voice cheerful as ever. "Did you forget me?" "I've just been busy," she replied. "Busy pretending everything's fine?" He teased lightly. She didn't answer. He chuckled softly. "I'm having a small get-together this weekend. Nothing wild, just food, laughter, people. You should come." She hesitated. "Ryan, I don't think Emma." He said gently, "You need to stop thinking and start living." Something about his words struck her. She agreed, telling herself it was harmless, just another party. When Saturday came, Daniel had left early for a client meeting, and the silence in the house felt suffocating. Without overthinking, she dressed simply and drove to Ryan's downtown apartment. It was a modern place with glass walls overlooking the city. Music played softly in the background, and a few people stood around with drinks. Ryan spotted her instantly. "You came," he said with that easy grin. "I said I would," she replied. He handed her a glass of sparkling water and led her to the balcony. The view was stunning. The city lights shimmered like scattered stars. "You look like you belong up here," he said. She smiled, trying not to blush. "You always say things like that, because they're true." He talked about everything: travel, work, dreams. But under his charm, Emma sensed something else, a quiet sadness. The kind people hide behind laughter. At one point he said, "You know what I like about you? You don't try too hard. Most people do." "Maybe I just stopped trying a long time ago," she replied softly. He looked at her carefully, his tone changing. "You don't have to stay stuck, Emma. Life's too short to live half awake." His words lingered in her mind long after she left. When she returned home that night, Daniel was already asleep. She watched him for a moment, feeling both love and distance, a painful mix of what used to be and what could never be again. Days turned into weeks. Emma found herself torn between three worlds: the quiet comfort of her marriage, the emotional depth of Ethan, and the thrilling unpredictability of Ryan. It wasn't about choosing between men anymore. It was about choosing who she wanted to be. One afternoon she stopped by a cafe to clear her head. To her surprise, she saw Ethan there, but he wasn't alone. Across the table sat a woman laughing warmly with him. They looked close, comfortable. Emma froze. She didn't mean to stare, but it hurt. She quickly turned away and left before he could notice. That evening, Ethan called. "I saw you today," he said. She tried to sound casual. "I was just passing by." "You left before I could explain," he said softly. "That woman? She's my sister." Emma felt relief and embarrassment mixed together. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's okay," he replied. "Maybe it's good you saw me. It reminded me how easily we misunderstand what we don't talk about." His words made her quiet. "Maybe we shouldn't talk for a while," she said after a pause. There was silence on the line. "Then a gento, if that's what you need." She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. A few days later, Ryan texted again. "You've been quiet. Don't disappear on me." She hesitated before replying. "Maybe I need to figure things out," he answered. "Then start by not running from yourself." His message stirred something in her, not romantic excitement this time, but a strange curiosity. Who was she when no one else defined her? That night, Daniel brought home takeout. He seemed tired, but he smiled. "I booked that weekend trip," he said. "Just you and me." She looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who had once been her best friend, her safe place. Maybe it wasn't too late to find their way back. The next weekend, they drove to the coast. The sea was calm, the wind soft. They walked barefoot on the sand, talking about old memories, their first apartment, their silly arguments, their forgotten dreams. For a while, it felt almost like before. Daniel took her hand and said quietly, "I know I've been distant. I thought providing was enough, but I forgot how to love you the way you needed." Tears filled her eyes. "We both forgot," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe we can remember together." That night, they sat by the fire, wrapped in quiet peace. Emma realized that love wasn't always about excitement or new faces. Sometimes it was about choosing the same person again, even after you've lost your way. But life has a way of testing us. Just when we think we've found balance, when they returned home Sunday night, Emma's phone buzzed, a message from Ryan. "Need to tell you something. It's important." She hesitated, then replied, "Can it wait?" He responded, "No, it's about Ethan." Her heart skipped. What could Ryan possibly know about Ethan? She called immediately. Ryan's voice was serious. "You deserve to know the truth. Ethan isn't who you think he is. He's been working with my firm, a freelance photographer, for one of our marketing projects. And he knew who you were before you met." Emma froze. "What do you mean?" "He saw your husband's company listed in our client files. He knew you were Daniel Clark's wife. He never told you because he thought it would ruin things." Emma's world tilted. "That can't be true," she whispered. "I wish it wasn't," Ryan said softly. "But it is." She hung up and sat in silence. Her chest ached, not with anger, but with disbelief. The man who had made her feel seen had seen her only through someone else's story. The next morning, Sri drove straight to Ethan's studio. When he opened the door, she didn't waste words. "You knew who I was before we met." He looked down, ashamed. "I did. I was going to tell you. But then I met you, and it stopped being about your husband. It became about you." "That doesn't make it right," she said, tears in her voice. "You took my trust and turned it into a secret." He stepped closer, his expression full of regret. "Emma, I never meant to hurt you." But she shook her head. "You already did." She walked away, her heart heavy but clear for the first time. That evening, Daniel found her on the porch, staring at the sunset. "You okay?" he asked gently. "No," she said honestly. "But maybe I will be." She leaned on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Not because life was simple, but because she had finally stopped running from herself. For days after confronting Ethan, Emma felt empty. It was as if something inside her had quietly collapsed. She went about her routine, cooking breakfast, answering emails, folding laundry, But everything felt like a play she was pretending to be part of. Her heart was tired. Her thoughts circled the same questions over and over. Why did she let it all happen? Why had she searched for meaning in the wrong places? Daniel tried to be patient. He could sense she was struggling, but he didn't push. Instead, he stayed gentle, small gestures like brewing her favorite tea, turning off his phone at dinner and listening when she spoke. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. One morning, while driving to the grocery store, Emma passed the art gallery where she'd first met Ethan. She slowed down but didn't stop. The sight of the glass windows reminded her of how everything had started, innocent, curious, and slowly complicated. She realized now it wasn't just about Ethan or Ryan. It was about something much deeper. She had been searching for validation, for someone to remind her she was still interesting, still worth noticing. And that longing had blinded her to the truth she'd ignored for years. She had stopped noticing herself that night. While Daniel was reading on the couch, Emma sat beside him quietly. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. He looked up from his book. "Always. I've been lost," she said simply. "Not because of anyone else, because of me. I forgot how to live for myself. And in that space, I made mistakes." Daniel set the book down. His eyes were full of concern, but also softness. "Emma, everyone gets lost sometimes. You don't have to explain everything. I've made mistakes too. I thought working harder would make us happier, but it only made us strangers." His words hit her deeply. For years, they had both been drifting parallel lives in the same house. Now, finally, they were facing it. They talked for hours about everything they had ignored. The loneliness, the resentment, the fear of saying the wrong things. It wasn't easy, but it felt like tearing down walls that had been there for too long. When she went to bed that night, Emma didn't feel fixed, but she felt lighter. For the first time, there was hope. Not the reckless kind that came from escaping, but the quiet kind that came from rebuilding. A week later, Ryan called again. She almost didn't answer, but something in her needed closure. "Emma," he said, "I wanted to apologize for how everything happened. I shouldn't have gotten involved in what wasn't mine. I thought I was helping when I told you about Ethan, but maybe I just made things worse." "You told me the truth," she said calmly. "It hurt, but it helped me see things clearly. So, thank you." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, I did care about you. Not in a careless way, but genuinely. You reminded me what real connection feels like." She smiled sadly. Maybe we both needed that reminder. There was silence on the line, and then he said softly, "Take care of yourself, Emma." "You too, Ryan." When she hung up, she realized something had shifted. She didn't feel guilt or confusion anymore. She felt gratitude for what had been, for what had taught her something, and for what she was finally ready to let go. A few days later, Emma received a letter in the mail, no sender's name, just her address written neatly on the envelope. Inside was a short note from Ethan. "Emma, I owe you one last apology, and not just for the lie I told. You've taught me something: that connection built on half-truths doesn't last. I didn't mean to hurt you, and I'll always be grateful for the honesty you brought into my life. I hope you find peace, and that you never stop being the woman who feels deeply." Emma folded the letter carefully and put it away in a drawer. She didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet acceptance that some people come into your life not to stay, but to teach you what you need to learn. Months passed. The seasons began to change. Daniel and Emma's relationship slowly grew stronger. Not perfect, but honest. They took walks in the evenings again, laughed at old memories, and found small joys in the simplest routines. One Sunday morning, Daniel surprised her with a trip to the coast. "Just a day away," he said with a grin. "No plans, no schedules." They drove with the windows down, music playing softly, the ocean smell growing stronger as they neared the beach. When they reached the shore, Emma took off her shoes and let the sand press between her toes. The waves rolled in, calm and endless. Daniel watched her with a gentle smile. "You look peaceful," he said. "I think I finally am," she replied. He took her hand. I used to think love was supposed to feel exciting all the time. But now I think it's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. She looked at him, her eyes warm. That's what I forgot. I kept waiting for something new to make me feel alive. But it was always right here. I just stopped seeing it. They walked together in silence, the sun dipping low in the sky that evening. As they drove home, the car was quiet but comfortable. Emma leaned her head against the window, watching the road blur past. For the first time, she didn't feel torn between choices or haunted by what-ifs. She had finally found peace in the mess of her own story. When they got home, she went to her room and opened her journal, something she hadn't touched in years. On the first blank page, she wrote, "I took a risk and lost pieces of myself. But I also found the truth that love isn't about chasing something new. It's about rediscovering what's real. And maybe that's what growing up really means, not finding perfection, but learning how to choose peace over chaos." She closed the journal and smiled faintly. It felt like the end of a long, stormy season and the beginning of something quieter, more grounded. A few weeks later, Emma ran into Lauren at a cafe. Her friend hadn't seen her in months and was eager to catch up. "You look different," Lauren said, tilting her head. "In a good way." Emma laughed softly. "Maybe I just stopped fighting everything." Lauren grinned. "So what happened to the two guys who turned your world upside down?" Emma thought for a moment. "They were lessons, not mistakes." "Lessons in what?" "In remembering who I am," she said simply. Lauren nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'd say it was worth it." They shared a smile, and Emma realized how much had changed, not just around her, but inside her. She didn't crave attention anymore. She craved peace. Months later, while cleaning out a drawer, Emma found Ethan's letter again. She read it one last time, then placed it back carefully. She didn't need to keep it, but she didn't want to throw it away either. It was a chapter one she had lived, learned from, and closed. That evening, as Daniel came home from work, he found her cooking dinner and humming softly to herself. "You seem happy," he said. "Surprised, I am," she replied, smiling at him. For real this time. He walked over, kissed her forehead, and said, "Then I guess we're both finally home." In the quiet of that moment, Emma realized something profound. Sometimes life breaks us only to rebuild us stronger. Sometimes we lose our way to find our truth. She had walked through guilt, confusion, and heartbreak, but in the end, she had found honesty, forgiveness, and love. Not the movie kind, the real kind. The kind that grows quietly day after day. In the spaces where understanding replaces judgment, she looked out the window at the setting sun and thought to herself, "I took a risk and it broke me, but it also showed me who I really am." And that truth, she knew, was worth everything.